Hello and welcome to this episode of Unearth Horticulture. I should say good morning. I woke up bright and early to shoot this film before it got a little bit too hot and spicy. We are reaching that time of the summer that it is getting hot in the middle of the day. So I encourage you to do your gardening early in the morning, first thing, because it's a beautiful time of day to wake up, get your day started, check the garden, and see everything that you are producing. It's a great way to start the day. And can you tell I am a morning person? Anyways, today's topic is herb gardening. We're not quite warm enough to see some of those first tomatoes and peppers ready to pick. But there is one thing in the garden that is thriving right now, and that is the herbs. Herbs are one of those things in gardening that offer the most flexibility, I would say, as far as edible gardening is concerned. If I were to recommend starting out with anything, if you've not done any edible gardening, it would be to start with herbs. Herbs are very easy because you can grow them in containers on the front porch or patio, but you can also grow them in ground in your gardens. You can grow them in part shade to full sun. They offer a little bit more flexibility on their light requirement. And also, they're a little bit more forgiving on the disease side. You know, you're not going to struggle with blossom end rot in your herbs like you would in a tomato bed. So herbs are definitely what I would consider the gateway, the gateway plants group in edible outdoor gardening. So without further ado, I wanted to jump into our first part of this topic. I have my basket here to harvest into, but I also have my trusty tools here, and I wanted to talk you through what tools you want to use for harvesting herbs. Now, there are many tools out there that are labeled as like herb harvesting scissors, you know. So I've got these Corona scissors. These are made for harvesting herbs. They're very sharp and they're made for cutting through live plant tissue. And I wouldn't recommend these if you're harvesting any kind of woody herbs because they're not really built for that, and you could dull your scissors really quickly. But for things like parsley or basil, scissors are a great tool. I prefer to use my standard gardening snips. So I've got these Felco snips. They're like 20 bucks at Johnson's Garden Center, I think. You can find them around. Felco is a Swiss brand of tool, and I really love Felcos. I'm actually addicted to Felco as a tool brand because they're very high quality, and they're made to last, and they're made to clean and to have for a lifetime, and probably to pass on to your children. I know I have a few of my grandpa's gardening tools that you may or may not. Okay, what makes Felcos nice is they've got kind of this rounded tip. You can see there's a rounded tip. And that's nice for harvesting herbs that are very soft tissued because it's not going to poke holes in the leaves like of your basil. Then I also have this tool. This is more of what I've collected. This tool I collected during my time in commercial greenhouse. What's nice about this is it's a curved bladed snips, and they're very tiny points. So these are a little bit sharper when it comes to poking holes in leaves, but they're very, very sharp. So they're a little bit better for woodier herbs, and they're great for getting in there and being a little bit more detail oriented about how you're harvesting. So honestly, tools are all about you as the grower, as the harvester. What do you like to use? I like having something I can close my hand around a little bit more rather than sticking my fingers into. So that's why I'm not as inclined to use the herb scissors. But hey, if you've got them on hand or if you like to use them, they're more than adequate for this job. But tools, just try some things out and see kind of what you like. Think about what you're harvesting. That oftentimes helps with when you're picking out tools. So let's take a look at our first herb. Let's take a look at lavender. So lavender is actually my favorite plant of all time. That includes houseplants and vegetables and flowers. This is my favorite plant, and it's mostly because it's multi-purpose. And as a greenhouse grower, if you are a grower, you might understand liking things that are multi-purpose. So it's culinary use, there's ornamental use, there's cut flower use. You can use it medicinally, therapeutically. Lavender is just one of those lovely plants that you can use it for everything. Not to mention it keeps mosquitoes away. So that is a pro. So when you harvest lavender, actually the best time to plant lavender, if you've noticed, I have it for sale on the bus right now. The best times to plant lavender is either at the end of May, beginning of June. This is actually a good rule of thumb for most perennial plants or plants that come back every season. Or you can plant it about 1 month before our average last frost date. So that would be around September, beginning of September to middle of September. And the reason you plant it at those times is because it allows for those roots to get established in ground before it gets too extremely hot. But also you want those warm soil temperatures to help those roots really tap into the soil. So that's just a little pro tip on planting lavender. Now, as far as harvesting lavender goes, it's blooming right now about beginning of June time. And some lavenders actually bloom twice in a season, but a lot of the heirloom varieties only bloom once. This is actually an heirloom variety called Munstead. And I grow Hidcote in a hedge over on the south flower garden, but I also grow Munstead here in my culinary herb garden because I like its flavor for culinary use. When you harvest lavender, it's actually early to harvest lavender right now. You want it to be at peak blooming time, so at full bloom or just on the other end of that bloom hill, if you want to call it that, because that's when the oils are going to be, the oils that provide that lavender flavor and scent are going to be most developed in the flower head. And when you do harvest, you're going to want to take it down to just above the woody part of the shrub. So it's always a little nerve-wracking for me even to harvest lavender. You might end up with about 2 to 3 inches of leafiness on the stem. And it's up to you. If you're gonna dry this for culinary use, which is usually what I recommend, if you're gonna use it culinarily to dry it, I strip the lower leaves and then you end up with a stem of lavender. I make a big bunch of them, I rubber band or twine them together, and then I hang them upside down to dry in a dark area that's dry. You don't want a humid environment for drying flowers because you can end up with moldy flowers. But like I said, it's still a little bit early to harvest your lavender, but oh my goodness, it smells so good. You can always harvest it at any time to have in a vase in your house. Next up, we have flat leaf Italian parsley. And this is actually a new variety that I grew this year in the greenhouse. It's called Giant of Italy. And parsley is an interesting plant because it's actually in the carrot family, the Apiaceae family. And it is considered a biennial or even sometimes an annual. That means that if it does come back in the second year, it's going to be for flowering purposes and not for vegetative purposes. So it's not going to be good in the second year for harvest if it does come back. That's if it does come back. Now, that means you're just going to want to replace plants every spring when you plant it out in the garden. But it's one of those, similarly to cilantro, that you can plant pretty early because it doesn't mind a little bit chillier temperatures in the garden. So it has what we consider a basal growth habit. So what that means is it's going to all of its oldest growth is going to be on the outside of the plant, and the newest growth is going to be coming from the center base of the plant. So when you harvest your parsley, you're going to want to harvest it, the exterior leaves, the oldest leaves first. And when you do harvest it, you're going to want to harvest that whole stem. And this is truly Giant of Italy parsley. It is really quite glorious parsley. I will be growing this variety next year. But after you harvest it, you've got that whole stem, and that actually increases the post-harvest life. So if you're not using this parsley right away, you can always put the stems in a jar of water on the countertop in the kitchen after you've washed it, and it should last for a decent amount of time in there. You might notice that I'm out here in the morning. Part of that is for my own comfort, but also it's always best to harvest produce and plants in the morning when it's cool, or in the evening. Actually, morning time is always best because your plants are not under stress. They're not going to be wilty, and they're the perkiest at this time of day. So their post-harvest life is going to last a lot longer if you harvest in the morning time. So I'm going to harvest a few more stems of this because we're going to use this later today in a recipe. Next up on this herb train is thyme. And thyme is probably, I say this about every herb though, is probably the scent that I most associate with summer because it smells so good. And if you've ever seen that creeping thyme that you can plant in walkways, that's like one of my first memories as a kid, was rubbing my toes in that because it's so soft and so good. You should get some creeping thyme. I don't have it on the bus, but maybe someday. But I do sell thyme on the bus, just your simple Thymus vulgaris, your common thyme. And what I would say about this, a good lesson with thyme especially, or any herb, you never want to harvest more than 50% of the plant at one time. And that's simply because you don't want to remove that plant's ability to produce photosynthates. And that is a big fancy word, which just means the sugars that a plant produces from photosynthesizing. So if you remove more than half the plant, it's not going to have leaves enough to produce photosynthates to feed new growth. And that's what you want with herbs. You want them to, after you harvest them, to refill in a way, in a sense, regrow the part that you just removed. So it's really important never to do more than 50%. Now I've got a big hedge of thyme, but if you just planted one of my thyme plants, this started as 3 of those last year. So it's really nice to have perennial herb stand because it allows you to harvest more freely. When they're really young, you can't harvest quite as much at one time. But when you harvest thyme, you can take it all the way back to the woody base of the plant and harvest a pretty good chunk of stems. One thing I love about thyme is because it's a plant that is from an arid climate, it dries really well. So similarly to lavender and rosemary, these plants are all from arid Mediterranean climate, and they are built to hold their oils in dry conditions. So that makes those herbs a lot nicer to dry for culinary purposes. Whereas plants like basil and chives and parsley, all of those plants are going to lend themselves more to fresh use in recipes so that they are the most flavorful. That doesn't mean you can't use them dried in a pinch, but they're just not as good, right? I actually recommend freezing those herbs if you want to preserve them for winter use, preserve your herbs for winter use. So you can collect a little bundle of thyme. Really, if you're incorporating thyme into recipes, you're using the leaves, or you might throw the whole stem into the recipe, but you're not going to be eating that stem because they're pretty woody stems, even when it's new growth like this. So you'll be removing that. That would not be a good texture for your guests to eat, or for you, for that matter. So I'm going to harvest a few more stems of thyme here. The other thing you might consider when harvesting is thinking about the overall shape of the plant. You know, if you take a big chunk out of the center of the plant, that's not going to look very nice. So I'm always thinking about the aesthetic side of harvesting herbs as well. I try to stick to around the outer side of the plant, and keeps it a little bit more contained in my herb planting as well. Moving right along here, the next herb I have for you is basil. And this is probably the most popular herb that is out there to grow, partly because it grows so well in Kansas. It loves the heat. In fact, when I am growing this in the greenhouse in January, it is a little bit on the sad side. And it doesn't really start to thrive until it can get in ground outside and experience our Kansas summer sun and temperatures. So at least something is thriving this time of year. Am I right? Well, anyways, basil is a lovely herb to have on hand because you can use it fresh in caprese salad, so it complements your tomatoes really well in your garden. And also, it's just really nice to have in vinaigrettes. There's all kinds of things you can use it in. I've even used it in with some lemon and sparkling water. It's really good infused in water. So drinks, it's really good for. But yes, basil's really great. The main trick with basil to think about when you're harvesting it is that it tends to get these pesky flowers. Once it starts to get warm, it starts going into reproductive mode. And those flowers aren't good, because when a plant ever goes into flower, that means it's focusing on reproduction and not on producing leaves or vegetative growth. And that's what we want herbs for. We want them to produce leaves so that we can have them in our pastas and our drinks. So it's always important to remove any flowers that you start to see forming on basil plants. So I like to do that as I'm harvesting basil. So I just topped this basil plant right here, but you can see right here in the center growing point, there's the start of a flower starting to form. And as you grow basil, you'll be able to tell a lot quicker when a flower is starting to form. But it doesn't hurt to have a flower on the top of your basil stem. You can use all of these leaves after you harvest it. So I like to multitask when I'm harvesting my basil. I like to remove flowers and harvest leaves while I'm at it. Basil is one of those plants you're going to want to harvest periodically, even if you're not using it in recipes. Find a way to incorporate it into vases on your countertops, because harvesting basil is going to make it produce better. So even if you're not planning to use it anytime soon, which I recommend you do, just start using basil more. Keeping those flowers at bay is going to help your plants be healthier in the long run. This is a perfect opportunity to talk about, when you harvest basil, where are you actually cutting on the stem? Not just basil, any herbs in general that have leaves, broadleaf herbs. So maybe not your chives. That's going to be another story here in a second. But when you're harvesting herbs, where are you cutting on the stem? And I'm going to show you an up close of this. But when you're cutting your herbs, you want to make sure that you're cutting just above the point where there are new branches forming. That is what we call the node on the stem. And that node is where there are hormones that can produce new growth on the stem. So if you cut just above that, you remove any excess stem that's going to be there, and you're going to allow for a nice bushy plant to fill back in. Those branches, those little secondary branches that are already forming, are going to take over and make that plant even bushier. I hope that makes sense. But I'm just going to continue to kind of prune some of these flowers off and harvest more basil. This is actually my tri-basil, and it's multiple varieties of basil that was grown in one pot. And I like to do that for customers so that they can have a taste of the purple basil and the Genovese, and also have that really pretty aesthetic of the lettuce leaf basil, those huge leaves that I feel like you could make like lettuce leaf wraps out of those basil leaves, like, you know, like the P.F. Chang's lettuce wraps. I'm such a nut. Anyways, tangent. Look at that beautiful lettuce leaf. Let's talk about chives. Now, you may notice on this plant that it's got these little pom-pom-like flowers going on. They're actually the spent flowers, and chives are always the first herb to come up in the spring, and also the first one to flower. And these flowers are actually edible, and they've got a really nice pink lavender color to them. Sometimes there's white chives as well. But the flowers, I don't typically like to eat them because they're very dense and papery, but you're more than welcome to throw them on a salad for prettiness. The stalk that is holding up the flower stem, looks like the leaves of the chives, but it is not at all like it. It doesn't have the same flavor, and it's very woody because it needs to be strong to hold up those flowers, especially when it gets windy or stormy or rainy. Those flowers need to stand tall and proud. So I really don't recommend harvesting those flower stalks for eating. They will eventually, after the flower fully senesces, the seeds have dispersed out of the flower, they will eventually turn tan and woody and brown, and they're really easy to just pull out of the plant. So I don't recommend, you don't have to go in there and actually cut out all the flowers. I used to do that, and it is completely unnecessary. Just let the plant go and finish its reproductive cycle, produce its seeds, and then the flower will die, and it's easy to remove. Now, as far as harvesting goes, I like to find the base of the plant. I like to harvest chives around the edges to keep it nice and clump shaped. And if you notice up close here, they're kind of formed like like a bunch of onions growing really close together. You've got several of these leaves coming from one little clump within the clump. And if you harvest above that point, I would harvest leaves, not the center top growing leaf, because they're kind of stacked. You can kind of see that. It's not going to be the end of the world if you take a huge clump off of it, let's be real, but it's kind of that's like an OCD thing of mine. Kind of harvest the oldest growth first if you can. So that'll be the leaves lowest on that little clump that you see, and I'll show you an up close here. So this plant is on the older side. It's about 20 years old. I've lifted and divided it a couple of times, and what I mean by that is a lot of perennials, once they get about 5 to 10 years old, depending on the perennial, you actually want to lift it out of the soil and cut the root ball into sections and split it up, and that helps prevent it from dying back in the center. That's a video for another time. But that goes to say, I've got a big clump of chives here, so that allows me to harvest pretty much whenever I want to, just like I talked about with the thyme. But if you've got a new planting of chives, I highly recommend you never harvest more than 50%. Again, it's really important to establishing those herbs in your garden that you don't remove too many leaves at once. The last herb to talk about in my little raised bed garden here before we go over to my porch to talk a little bit more about my container herbs is my rosemary. And rosemary is one of those plants that frustrates a lot of people because they absolutely love rosemary. It is very unique flavor and scent, and I'm just petting it here because it smells so good. It complements so many flavors, so many foods. It's another one of those herbs that's great for drying. Now, this is a new plant for me growing in the greenhouse, and it was a big learning curve. I actually started it before Christmas time, and it took quite a bit of time in production to grow just because I keep my greenhouse on the cooler side to save energy in the winter, and rosemary loves the heat. It does not do well in our cool climates over winter. It's actually an evergreen, and it tends to dry out and get on the cold side. So it's got two sides of stress that can kind of prevent it from coming back as a perennial in Kansas. Now, that doesn't mean it can't happen, because I've had someone mention that they had it maybe on the south side of their house next to the foundation, and it came back for 20 years. But it's a very slim chance that this plant is going to come back every year unless you plant it in a pot and maybe overwinter it in your garage or overwinter it in the house. I just can imagine in the house it might have some spider mite issues over winter when it's a little bit drier. But rosemary is really nice to have in your garden, so I tend to replant it every year, and I'm really excited to try out this variety and see how it does over winter. So we'll have to try it together. When you harvest rosemary, it's very similar to its relatives, basil, mint. You just want to make sure you don't remove too much, but find a place on the stem that's not woody yet and harvest just above where there are other branches branching out, and then you can have a little sprig of rosemary, and it's great for drying, so I'm going to do that. But rosemary, it is another quintessential herb. All right, so that pretty much wraps up what I've got going on out here in the kitchen garden, in the in-ground, in the raised bed garden. Let's go check out what's going on in the front porch gardenette. So I made my way up to the front porch, and I have several herbs up here in pots that I wanted to talk about. The first one is mint, and if I show you my mint, it's going to give you, it's going to make you feel better, I think, about yourself. This is my spearmint, and you know what? It's okay to have things look like this. So mint is actually a big attractant of different pollinator caterpillars, and so is parsley and dill and things like that. And so this actually got quite demolished by caterpillars, but thankfully mint is a very aggressive plant. So I have no doubt that it's going to make a comeback out of this mess that it is right now. I'm just not going to be able to use this for a little bit. So I'm not going to harvest it and show you how to do mint, but I will say this much. Mint is great to put in containers so that it doesn't become a weed, because it does spread by stolons underground, which is underground runners, that and it can just pop up throughout your garden, and it's really hard to get rid of once it's there. So mint is a great candidate for a container. Plus, it's that much closer for you on the front porch if you want a sprig in your iced tea. This right here is one of my boxwood basils, and they're a little dwarf miniature basil. They're sometimes called Greek basil, and I notice it's starting to flower a little bit already. And the thing about the boxwood basil is you actually want to shape it. So this is a perfect opportunity to talk about shaping herbs as you're harvesting them. I talked a little bit about it as I was talking about harvesting around the base, but when you're working on herbs, you're wanting to remove those flowers, but you're also wanting, especially on herbs like your boxwood basil that is supposed to have a shape, to kind of create a little bit of a roundy-moundy growth habit. I always heard my professors say roundy-moundy, and now I know I'm one of them. But yes, keeping it shaped is really important. So harvesting above those secondary branches like I was talking about, this is where actually my little curved snips would come in handy. But keeping it to a shape is really important so that you've kind of got a little compact looking boxwood basil. Now, the boxwood basil for me isn't something I use a ton of in recipes. I'm always growing other types of basil. It's more of just a cute little something to have on our front porch, but it does have a really nice flavor, and you can kind of see how small the leaves are. So it still works really well in the place of an Italian basil, but it's more so wonderful for the shape and the look of it. It's so adorable. Speaking of shapes, let's take a look at my tower basils. So here we have a couple of my tower basils, and if you are a customer of the bus, you know last year I grew this Everleaf Emerald Tower Basil, and it was such a huge hit. I had such a fun time with it. I added Thai basil this year, and that was also a requested herb. And the breeder actually makes a Thai tower basil, so I thought, why not? The tower basils are very interesting because they've got this upright growth habit, very columnar in shape, and that makes them well suited to containers, because if you've grown basil before, you might know that it really sprawls and spreads. The other beauty of this particular line of herbs by the breeder is that they're an everleaf variety. So they flower about 8 to 12 weeks later than other basil varieties. So you're not always worried about trimming off all the flowers all the time. But how do you actually harvest from these tower basils? So a lot of times people don't want to harvest from the tops because they're trying to get them to grow tall. And that's more than fine. You don't have to. But what I gotta say is these genetics are naturally bent to growing tall. So even if you harvest off the tops, like I'm about to do, like you would a standard basil, they're still gonna grow upright. They're still gonna have this stretching upward habit. So it's not the end of the world. But if you really wanna see how fast you can get this plant 3 to 5 feet tall, you're more than welcome to let the tops continue to keep on keeping on, and just start harvesting side stems off the side of the plant. So it's up to you, and that's what I was talking about a little bit with the boxwood basil. You kind of get to shape your plants as you're growing them. And so harvesting the side branches is going to help those top growth terminals, the top growing points of the plant, continue to stretch ever upward. So yes, I highly recommend these varieties for the basil lover, especially if you want to plant them in a pot. Now, you can also grow them in ground. I've done that as well, but they're really cool on the front porch or on a patio because of their height and shape. Really cool plants. I still have several on the plant beds. So if you didn't get one of these, it's not too late. Alrighty folks, that's all I have for you today on this episode. I hope you learned a little bit more about how to harvest herbs. And if you haven't already planted an herb garden, I still have so many herbs for sale on the bus, including my oh so special lavender this year. So make sure you pop in and grab your plant so that you can have as much fun as I'm having this summer. And there were several herbs that I didn't include in this video. So make sure if you have any questions to drop them in the comments below. And until next time, you've been watching Unearth Horticulture.